All right, here we go. Ezekiel chapter 7. We are continuing in our look at the book of Ezekiel. We've gotten to the point, started back in chapter 4 with some object lessons, moving into chapter 5, and then chapter 6 and chapter 7 is a continuing discussion of the punishment that's going to come upon Judah. We mentioned on a couple of occasions that the book of Ezekiel was written probably about 592. 596, Ezekiel went into captivity. 596, 597. 586, the city of Jerusalem was laid flat and the temple was burnt. So the first part of this book was written kind of right in the middle, in between those two events. And we've talked before about the fact there were a lot of Jews, a lot of false prophets who thought that this captivity was going to last 2 or 3 years. They were going to be able to go back home. And Ezekiel tries to convince them that that's not the case. There's one other thing that I think we need to make mention of, and that is the Jews in that day and age placed a lot of trust and a lot of faith in the fact that God had picked the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the city, and that God's temple was in Jerusalem. And their belief was, as long as God was God, that city and that temple was okay. Nothing is going to happen to them because they had the temple. And one of the messages of Ezekiel is that temple as a building doesn't mean a whole lot. That temple was supposed to be a representation of their relationship with God, where they met to worship God. And the fact they had turned their backs on God made that temple just like any other building. But they didn't seem to understand that, and part of Ezekiel is trying to get them to grab a hold of that. Chapter 7 says, "The word of the Lord came to me, and you, O son of man, thus says the Lord God, the land of Israel, the end has come upon the four corners of the land. Now the end is upon you, and I will send my anger upon you. I will judge you according to your ways. I will punish you for all your abominations. And my eye will not spare you, nor will I have pity. And I will punish you for your ways while your abominations are in your midst. Then you will know that I am the Lord." There's several things in that verse, and those verses, the very first thing he starts out in verse 1 by saying, "The word of the Lord came to me." We need to always keep in mind when we're reading the Bible, even though Ezekiel may have actually written down these words, or somebody who worked with Ezekiel, these are not Ezekiel's words. These are God's words. And over the Bible reminds us of the fact that this book came from God. This is the word of the Lord. This is not the word of man. And then he refers to Ezekiel as son of man. We talked about that when we began to study the book. You remember the New Testament, that's Jesus' most popular use in reference to himself. He called himself son of man more than he used any other term when he came to himself. And the word son of man carries with it the idea of being a servant or a minister, a helper. And that's what Ezekiel is trying to be. Remember, we also mentioned he's a priest. He starts this chapter by talking about the fact that the end is coming. He says the end, and he says the end upon the four corners of the land. What does four corners of the land mean? The whole land, the whole nation. In that statement would probably have been included the northern part, even though the Jews were not living there anymore. They'd gone off into Babylon, into Assyrian captivity. But that part of Israel was still considered by the Jews part of their land. And so the four corners of the land, all of the nation, everything in it, that's what this end is referring to. He says, "I will spend my anger upon you. I will judge you according to your ways, and I will punish you for all your abominations." We talked last week about the fact we need to make sure when we get a view of God, we get a full view. God's a God of mercy. God is a God of kindness. God is a God of compassion. God is also a God of justice. And a God of wrath. Notice he says in this verse, there are a lot of people today who doesn't think God ever gets mad. He says, "I will send my anger upon you." When you continually violate God's law, and you continually turn away from him, especially, remember Judah was not a pagan nation. Judah was God's chosen people. Judah had the law. They're supposed to be faithful to God. And when they turned away from Him and went off into idolatry, we don't like to think of it this way, but it really made God mad. And He said, I will spend my anger on you. I will punish you. I will not spare you, nor will I have pity. There reaches a point, and I think Scripture teaches this again and again. There reaches a point when man crosses a line that God has drawn, and God says, I'm done. That's it. And Judah had crossed that line. And God says, I'm not going to have any pity. I'm not going to spare you. I'm going to pull out the full vent of my anger and my wrath. And I'm going to punish you for the way that you have lived. Now, for centuries, for a long time, going all the way back to the time of Moses, God had tried to work with the children of Israel. They'd go off into idolatry, He'd punish them, they'd come back, and He'd bless them again. It was a continual cycle over and over and over and over again until finally God just said, I'm done. And you will pay the price for your wickedness and your insolence and your rejection of God. And so that's what He's talking about here. Notice the last phrase of verse 4. Then you will know I am the Lord. You will know I am God. You can only thumb your nose at God for so long. And we've got entire society pretty much is doing it today. Turning their backs on God and turning their back on His law and living the way they want to. And God will let you get by with that for a length of time. But eventually God says, I'm going to teach you a lesson. You're going to know who I am. You're going to respect me for who I am. Because I am God. We can't really, I don't think us finite humans can really grasp the fullness of the reality of who God is. Because we don't have in our day-to-day activity. Now, when the car was first invented, you remember what people called it? The horseless carriage. Because they compared it to a carriage. It was something they could compare it to. What do you compare God to? How do you understand who God is? I remember one time I went to hear a guy preach a sermon. The title of the sermon was, Who or What is God? And I'm thinking, we're going to be here for 6 months. How can you explain God? I don't know that you can. But he said, you're going to know that I'm God. Then says the Lord God, disaster after disaster, behold, it comes, and the end has come, the end has come, it is awakened against you. Behold, it comes, your doom has come to you, O inhabitant of the land. The time has come, the day is near, a day of tumult, and not of joyful shouting on the mountains. I will soon pour out my wrath upon you, and spend my anger against you, and judge you according to your ways, and I will punish you for all your abominations. And my eye will not spare, nor will I pity. I will punish you according to your ways. All your abominations are in your midst. And you will know that I am the Lord who strikes. And he begins this section of Scripture by talking disaster after disaster. One bad thing's going to happen. You're going to think it's over, and here comes another. And that bad thing's going to happen. You're going to think it's over, and here comes another. And that bad thing happens. You're going to think it's over, and here comes another. Disaster after disaster after disaster after disaster. You have to remember, 606, the Babylonians first came against the city of Jerusalem. In 597, they came back. That's twice. In 586, they came back again. That's 3 times in 20 years. And the third time, the city of Jerusalem was laid flat. We talked last week about the fact that chapter 6 talks about the famine and the disease and the want and all those things that were associated with that war. It was just one thing after another, after another, after another. Your doom has come to you. The end, the day is near, a day of tumult and not of joyful shouting on the mountains. What was happening on the mountains in that day and age, at that time?
Worshipping idols.
The high places were on the mountains. That's where they worshiped idols. And that joyful shouting on the mountains has a reference to the worship of those idols on the top of those mountains. And he says here, you're not going to have that joyful shouting anymore. It's going to be a day of tumult. It's going to be a day of mourning. It's going to be a day of sadness, not a day of shouting. Because their punishment, I will pour out my wrath upon you and spend there again his anger. Judge you according to your ways. Time and time again in Ezekiel, God tells them through the prophet Ezekiel, basically, you are getting what you deserve. I am dealing with you according to the way that you are living. One of the basic premises of God's judgment for man is that God judges us based on how we live. And that's true. Those of us who are in Christ receive grace that other people don't get. But our judgment is not a capricious judgment. God doesn't say, I'm going to get you and I'm going to leave you alone. I'm going to get you and I'm going to leave you alone. And I don't like you and I like you and I don't like you. No. It's a righteous judgment. It's a just judgment. Just based on the kind of people that we are. I will not have pity on you while your abominations are in your midst. So that word abomination, I believe, has reference to all of those things that went on with idol worship. It wasn't just the worship of idols, even though that was bad enough. There was all kinds of immorality and wickedness and unholiness that was associated with idol worship. There were what you and I today would call prostitutes who sold themselves, and they considered that to be worship to their idol gods. There was oftentimes all kinds of sexual uncleanness that would have been done at the altar of the idol god itself. And so there was a lot of immorality and a lot of wickedness and a lot of basically laughing at God that went on connected with all this idol worship. And he calls it abomination. The word is translated abomination in the Old Testament, strictly translated, it makes you sick to your stomach. These things make God sick to his stomach. He just couldn't handle it anymore. There again he says, you will know that I am the Lord who strikes. Now there are a lot of definitions of God in the Old Testament. It talks about the God of power, the God of might. It talks about the God of love and the God of mercy. One of the individuals I was reading in preparing for this class said that it would have surprised the Jews when they saw a phrase that said, the God who hits. Because that wasn't their picture of God. God didn't hit Jews. God struck Gentiles. God struck pagans. The problem was the Jews had become pagans. And because they had become pagans, they were going to be treated just like the other pagans. Even though they still, many of them had worshiped pagans or worshiped idol gods, and then on the Sabbath or other day they'd go to the temple and worship God. And somehow think that was okay. You can't do that. The most dangerous place a Christian can find himself is living in the middle of the world. One of my favorite illustrations is, a lot of you have gone fishing, you know about riding in a boat. When the boat's in the water, you're okay. When you get water in the boat, you're in trouble. And if you don't get that water out of that boat, you're going to sink. When the church is in the world, that's where we're supposed to be. It's where God placed us. When the world gets into church, then we've got a problem. And even though it wasn't referred to as the church in that time, that's exactly what had happened to Israel. The standards of the world had gotten into God's people. Now, they were living by the worldly standards. They were living by pagan standards instead of living by God's standards. Does anyone have a question or comment through verse 9? Beginning in verse 10, the day comes, behold it comes, your doom has come, the rod has blossomed, pride has budded. Greta and I have, there are in front of our house, on both ends of it, there are two big Confederate rose bushes. I love those bushes. I walked out 3 or 4 days ago, and those limbs on those bushes are full of little buds. What's going to happen to those buds? They're going to blossom. They're going to be flowers. And he says here, your pride has budded. There's a bud there. And it's fixing to become bloom. The only difference is, this is not going to be a bloom on flower. It's not going to be something pretty. Not going to be something you want to look at. This is the bloom of God's anger. Violence had grown up into a rod of wickedness. None of them shall remain, nor their abundance, nor their wealth, neither shall their preeminence among them. Think for a moment, when the Babylonians carried the Jews off into captivity, and they're probably all chained together on their way to Babylon. What difference did it make if you had $5 or $5 million? Not a bit. Money didn't matter. Possessions didn't matter. None of them shall, nor their abundance, nor their wealth. Everything that spent all of these years building up and gathering and gaining, going to be gone. And everybody at that point is going to be on the same basic level. We're all going to Babylon. We're all captives. We're all going to a foreign land. It doesn't matter how much money I got. It doesn't matter how much land I own, because my land's staying in Israel, and I'm going to Babylon. My house, my possessions, my animals, my everything. It's gone. The time has come, the day has arrived. Neither let the buyer rejoice or the seller mourn, for wrath is upon all their multitude. For the seller shall not return to what he has sold while they live, for the vision concerns all their multitude. It shall not turn back. Because of iniquity, none can maintain his life. You know, there are times in your life when you sell things, not because you want to, but because you have to. You need the money for something. You need to support yourself. You need to support your family. And the person who buys that is awful happy because he bought it. And the person who sold it is kind of upset because he had to sell it. And in this passage here, the prophet said, it don't make no difference. The buyer's not going to rejoice because what he gets, he's not going to get to keep. It's going to be gone. What difference does it make? The vision concerns all their multitude. It shall not turn back, and because of the iniquity, none can maintain his life. The life that you've built up, all these years that you worked, all these possessions that you own, all these things that you've got, all this stuff you've bought, all this money you've got put back. What would you do if you woke up tomorrow morning and every bit of that was gone? The house you live in belongs to somebody else. The car you drive has been repossessed. The money in your bank account is now gone. And the only thing you've got is the clothes on your back. That's Jews. No one can maintain his life. No one. Not the king, not the poorest pauper in the land. The life that you've gotten used to, the life that you've lived all of your life, is now vanished. And you're going off somewhere where you don't want to go. And you don't have any control over it. Think about being in subservice to a foreign country. The Babylonians now control everything the Jews do. They control where they live, they control how much money they make, they control what they own, they control everything. of us have been brought up in a land and in a great blessed place where we've never had that issue. If I want something and I want it bad enough, I can go work enough to pay for it. And it's mine. Now, how do you feel somebody comes and takes it away from you? That 30-year mortgage you paid off on your house, and now that house is mine. I own it. I don't have to worry about having a place to live. What happens if somebody comes and takes that house away from you? Takes away your security, takes away your livelihood, takes away everything that you have. But you're left with nothing. And not only are you left with nothing, you're left with nothing 3,000 miles away from home.
I had a thought there. You might compare it with the way that people from Central America have come to the United States. They were not forced to by someone at gunpoint, but almost like they were forced to. And they came here, had to leave everything except the clothes on their back. And they're carried away into captivity in the United States, and they're at the mercy of the people of the United States.
Verse 14, they have blown the trumpet, made everything ready, but none goes to battle, for my wrath is upon all their multitude. You got to remember, they didn't have the modern day forms of communication that we have today. In the city of Jerusalem, they were warned that the enemy was coming by the sound of the trumpet. Now that trumpet would blow a lot of different notes. Some of those notes were for celebration, some of those notes were to call people together to a meeting, and there was a certain sound that told you the enemy was coming. And he says the trumpet's being sounded, but nobody's going to battle. There were soldiers in Jerusalem, but for them to put up armed resistance against Babylon was futile, because they were going to lose. God had already determined, God already knew how this battle was going to turn out. The Babylonians were going to win, and the Israelites were going to lose. It didn't matter how hard they fought or how many soldiers they had. And so the picture here is resistance is futile. It's worthless. The sword is without, pestilence and famine are within. Who is in the field dies by the sword, and him who is in the city famine and pestilence devour. Now get this picture. We talked about this the last couple of weeks. The city of Jerusalem has walls all the way around it. They're probably 12 to 15, maybe some places even 20 feet high. The only way to get out of that city is through the gates. They had different gates, different spots of gates on different parts of the wall. Now, the Babylonian army has completely surrounded that city and cut it off. Nobody gets in. Nobody gets out. All the people who live in that city, in those houses, their gardens, their farms, their animals are outside the walls. How are they going to eat? They may have a little bit stored up at home, but not a whole lot. You know, they didn't have refrigerators and freezers and all this modern day stuff that we have now. I got enough food in my house, we could probably live 3 months. May not live good, but we could live. They didn't have that. And you cut that city off, and they're going to get awful hungry real quick. So you've got famine. Secondly, you've got pestilence or disease. They don't have the sanitation things that we have today. You've got people dying on the left of you, people dying on the right of you. You've got all kinds of disease going on because of the situation which you find yourself. And so you've got famine and disease and pestilence inside the city. And if you step outside the city, guess what happens? The Babylonian army kills you. And so if you're outside the city, you're going to die by sword. If you're inside the city, you're going to die by pestilence or famine. Eventually, you're going to die by sword, because eventually the Babylonians got into the city of Jerusalem. Then notice he goes on to say, even those who escape, if any survivor escape, they will be off on the mountains like doves in the valley, all of them moaning, each one over his iniquity. If they escape the city of Jerusalem and they run away, they would generally run to the mountains because that'd be the place of safety. What have they got with them? Their homes, their possessions, their things are all back home. They're all in Jerusalem. They're running for their lives. They got nothing to run with. They got nothing to feed themselves. They got nothing to protect themselves. They got nothing to provide for themselves. And as they run from the city of Jerusalem, guess who's chasing them? The Babylonian army. Their hands are feeble, and all knees turn to water. What's that phrase mean? All knees turn to water.
Weak knees.
You're just so weak. You're so scared. You just can't stand up. I have developed this problem over the last few years. A lot of times my right knee just buckles. I can be walking across the yard or across through the house, and guess what happens when that knee buckles? I hit the floor. And getting down there is not hard. So when that knee buckles, I'm going. The problem is getting back up. He said their hands are feeble. They can't do anything. Their knees are weak because they don't have anything at their disposal. They're scared. They don't have anything to fight back with. They put on sackcloth and horror covers them. What was sackcloth? You got any sack? My mama used to call them toe sacks. For the Jews, wearing sackcloth was a sign of extreme mourning and devastation. They only wore, it's kind of like, you've seen our American flag fly at half-staff. Have you ever seen it flown upside down? You know when the American flag is flown upside down? Like when the Jews wore sackcloth. If the United States was attacked and being defeated in battle, that flag would be turned upside down. So that's what it's a signal of. Wearing sackcloth. Shame is on all their faces, and baldness on all their heads. Now the Jews considered baldness to be a curse from God, especially for those who were younger. Now, for many of us, baldness is already a reality. And for others of us, it's getting closer every day. I tell people all the time, my hair's in a race. You can't decide whether it wants to turn gray or turn loose. And unfortunately, it's doing both. But for the Jews, it was a sign of great disgrace. Not have hair. And most of the time, not to have a beard. The Jews were widely known for having full-grown beards. That was a sign of manliness for them. They cast their silver into the streets, and their gold like an unclean thing. 10 years before this, they were giving their life to defend that silver. Take care of that gold. Now they're throwing it in the garbage. It's useless. When you are opposed by God, money doesn't amount to a whole lot. In fact, it pretty much amounts to nothing. Their silver and gold are unable to deliver them in the day of the wrath of the Lord. They cannot satisfy their hunger or fill their stomach with it, for it was a stumbling block of their iniquity. Why can't they satisfy their hunger? If I've got $1 million, surely I'd buy some food. Why can't I? No food to buy. If you've got $10 million, there's no food. If the shelves are empty, you got a lot. Money is useless, and not only is it useless, he tells them it's one of the problems with their iniquity. His beautiful ornament they use for pride, they made their abominable images and their detestable things out of it. Therefore I will make it an unclean thing to them. They took the book of Isaiah talking about pagans, so they go out in the woods, they cut down a tree, and they take this piece of wood, and they bedeck it with all kinds of jewels and silver and gold and all this fancy stuff, and they fall down and worship it. So this money, these things that God has blessed them with, they have now used to make idols out of. We don't have idols anymore, do we? We've talked about this on a couple of occasions. Yeah, we do. An idol is something you put between you and God. And for a lot of people today, that something is themselves. They've turned themselves into an idol. They've turned politics into an idol. They've turned sports into an idol. They've turned job into an idol. They've turned money into an idol. They've turned entertainment into an idol. Because they're giving to that thing what they ought to be giving to God. That's what an idol is. You know, we think of an idol. We think back in the Old Testament where they made those things and they felt that's their version of an idol. The American version of an idol is something a whole lot different. But we certainly still have idols. I will give it into the hands of the foreigners for prey and for the wicked of the earth for spoil, and they shall profane it. The Babylonians are going to get all your money. The Babylonians are going to get all your silver. The Babylonians are going to get all your gold. And I will turn my face to them, and they shall profane my treasured place. Robbers shall enter and profane it. Now think for a moment. When you think of the temple of God, the temple in Jerusalem, what do you think of? What comes to mind?
Sacrifices.
Sacrifices, worship. Do you think of beauty? This Solomon's temple was an amazing constructed building. You think about the fact that all of these stones that were used to build the walls of the temple, you know those were cut at the quarry at the exact size they needed. The timber beams that were used to build the walls and the ceilings, they were cut the exact size. There was not a hammer nor a screw heard inside that building when they put it together. They put it together just like a puzzle piece. The walls the outside walls were covered in gold. You could see this thing from miles away. And you think about that building being dedicated to the worship of God. You think about this is the place where Israelites go to worship God. This is the place in the Holy of Holies where God meets with His people. And then God says here, they shall profane my treasured place. Robbers shall enter and profane it. When the Babylonians took the city of Jerusalem, what do you think they did with all that gold and all that silver and all that bronze that was in and around the temple?
They took it home.
They took it with them. You remember in Daniel, if you remember that story in Daniel chapter 5 where Belteshazzar was having that feast, in the middle of that feast, he went and got the service items from the temple. They still had it. So they took all this stuff to Babylon. God is allowing a pagan nation to desecrate and destroy His temple. That really says something to me. That's what the Jews had placed. This temple is here. God won't allow anything to happen to this temple. Yes, He will. It's going to be laid flat. And everything in it's going to be gone. God's people's safety is found not in rituals and not in things, but in a relationship with God. The Jews had placed their trust in that temple. That building is there. That means we're okay. No. Your safety is found in your relationship with God, and you and I need to keep that in mind. My spiritual safety is not found in being in a church building, although being in a church building I think is vitally important. My spiritual safety is found in my relationship with my Father. And if that's not right, nothing else matters. That's what the Jews needed to learn. Their relationship with God was not right. And nothing else mattered. The temple didn't matter. The sacrifice to the temple didn't matter. The gold and silver and all that stuff that bedecked that temple with, and how beautiful and how glorious and how wonderful it was, none of that mattered. Because this relationship was wrong. They had forsaken their relationship with God, and instead of putting trust in God, they'd put trust in a building. You can't do that. You've got to have your relationship with God. I will bring the worst of the nations to take possession of their houses. I will put an end to the pride of the strong, and their holy places shall be profaned. It's interesting to me. This is one of the things that a lot of people have trouble with. The Babylonians were not, by any stretch of the means, righteous people. In fact, they were some of the most cruel, inhumane people that ever lived. When their armies attacked cities, it would be atrocious what they would do. They would take swords and put them in the belly of a pregnant woman and just rip it open. They would take babies from 5 years old and under, grab them by their feet, and slam their heads against concrete walls. They were inhumane. How in the world does God use those kind of people? What? They'd wake people up. Here's the issue. Did God make the Babylonians cruel and inhumane? No, they made that choice. God simply used that. Now, what eventually happened to the Babylonians? The same thing had happened in Jerusalem. God destroyed the Babylonian nation. When was the last time you heard of the Babylonian nation? The Babylonian Empire has been gone since 536 BC because God wiped it off the face of the earth. He held them accountable for their wickedness. Their wickedness was there. God used that to accomplish His will, and then He held them accountable for their wickedness. Their holy place shall be profaned at the reference to the temple. When anguish comes, they will seek peace, but there shall be none. There are some indications that when Nebuchadnezzar came against the city of Jerusalem the last time, that somewhere in that besiegement, the king of Judah sent word to Nebuchadnezzar, we want to negotiate some peace here. And Nebuchadnezzar said, nope, not doing it. Because he had negotiated terms of peace twice already. In 606 BC and in 595 BC. And the Jews had gone back on both of them. And at this point, Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm done. What I'm going to do is I'm going to destroy the city of Jerusalem. I'm going to destroy the nation of Judah, and it's going to be no more. I'm done with these people. Well, they sought for peace. It was too late. They seek a vision from the prophet while the law perishes from the priest and counsel from the elder. They look for help where they're supposed to look for help. The king and the priest and the prophet. That's where they're supposed to turn to for help. They didn't get any. What's very sad to me here is it says, while the law perishes from the priest. How sad is it? Those who are supposed to be God's priests don't know the law. How many preachers have we got in pulpits today who don't know the Word of God? How many elders have we got serving congregations who don't know the law? Those people out in the world are not expected to know the law. We are. We're God's people. We're supposed to know God's law. They did. The king mourns. The prince is wrapped in despair. The hands of the people of the land are paralyzed by terror. The king mourns. You always look to the king for leadership. You always look to the king for motivation. You always look to the king for help. And now the king sat over here crying. If he's doing that, what do you think the common people are doing? The hands of the people of the land are paralyzed by terror. They are scared out of their minds. Fear can paralyze you. According to the way I will do them, according to their judgments, I will judge them. And there again is that last phrase, they shall know I am the Lord. If you had asked them, a couple of years before these events started happening, you know who God is? Yeah, we know who God is. We know who Jehovah is. Did they really? Their life surely didn't evidence it. Because they were thumbing their nose at God through their idol worship, through their immorality, and through their wickedness. And one of the messages of the Babylonian captivity is, you're going to know who God is. And you're going to know what God expects of you. I mentioned last week, and I think I mentioned this a couple of times before, it's very interesting to me, and I know there are a lot of things that went on after that were not right. By no means, by the time Jesus came along, were the Jews a righteous people. Do you know that after the Babylonian captivity, the Jews never again worshipped idols? From Moses, even before Moses, to 586, they had off and on, more on than all, relationship with idolatry. Worshipping idols. After they went to Babylonian captivity and came back, never again. This Babylonian captivity did nothing else. It solved their problem with that kind of idolatry. They still had idols. Pharisees' idols were themselves. But they didn't worship Ra, and they didn't worship Molech, and they didn't worship Baal, and they worshiped all those things they worshiped in the Old Testament. They didn't worship the Roman gods, the Greek gods. Babylonian captivity cured that. Unfortunately, there are some other things that didn't cure. You want to have a question or comment on anything in chapter 7? We will pick up with chapter 8 next Sunday morning.